Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia and today we are continuing with our ChiBi Let's Talk Lore series. Last episode, we left off with Zhang Fei standing alone on top of Changban Bridge, defending what remains of Liu Bei's shattered forces. More concerning, rumors of Zhao Yun's betrayal has spread among Liu Bei's men, so let's pick up our story with Zhao Yun's side of the story. When Cao Cao's vanguard unit first made contact in the early hours of the morning, Zhao Yun was tasked with guarding the officers' families. But after a night of chaotic fighting, Zhao Yun finds himself lost among the refugees as the first ray of sun heralded in a new day. Lost and without a sense of direction, Zhao Yun rode around to gather up his remaining scattered forces and tried his best to find out the whereabouts of Liu Bei's two wives and, most importantly, Liu Bei's firstborn baby son Liu Chan, who was nicknamed A Dou. As Zhao Yun rode along the battlefield with only around 30 men, he finally locates a familiar face. Hiding in a bush was a wounded Jian Yong. Jian Yong tells Zhao Yun that he was the last one guarding the carriage that carried Liu Bei's two wives, but when they met the enemy, the two ladies abandoned the carriage to travel on foot. He fought the best he could, but took a spear to his leg and lost his horse. Zhao Yun quickly ordered one of his men to give up his horse over to Jian Yong and send off a small detachment to protect Jian Yong's escape. Then he took the remaining men towards the direction where Jian Yong had last seen Liu Bei's two wives. Soon they approached a large group of refugees, and Zhao Yun called out into the group to see if anyone had seen Liu Bei's wives. And surprisingly, Lady Gan was among the crowd and yelled back at Zhao Yun. Lady Gan informed Zhao Yun that she had gotten lost with Lady Mi during the chaos of the night, and A Dou was with Lady Mi. But as they were chatting, a large group of Cao Cao's men approached. Leading the way was Cao Ren's subordinate named Chun Yudao, and Zhao Yun could clearly see that Chun Yudao had taken Mi Zhu captive and had tied him up and laid him across the front of his saddle. It seems that Chun Yudao was on his way back to camp to show off his captive and get his reward, but unfortunately for him, he ran into Zhao Yun. Zhao Yun charged at him, and after a few exchanges, Zhao Yun's spear found its target, and Chun Yudao lay dead on the ground. Zhao Yun then charged back and forth among the now wavering group of men until he was able to free Mi Zhu and secure two horses for Mi Zhu and Lady Gan. Then Zhao Yun's group made a break for Changban Bridge, where Zhang Fei was waiting. And trust me, Cao Cao's men were not interested in chasing after Zhao Yun. When Zhao Yun's group approached Zhang Fei scolded at Zhao Yun and asked why had he decided to betray Liu Bei. Confused, Zhao Yun answers that he had never betrayed them. Zhang Fei then giggled and said, "I was just messing with you. Jian Yong had just retreated here and told me everything. Come across and get some rest." In no mood for jokes, Zhao Yun left Mi Zhu and Lady Gan with Zhang Fei and turned around and told Zhang Fei that Lady Mi and the little lord is still lost and that he would not return without them. As Zhao Yun's men rode back and forth through the chaotic battlefield, they ran into a general riding with only around 10 men. He had Cao Cao's personal banner and carried a spear in hand and a sword across his back. With no need for formalities, Zhao Yun did not even bother to announce himself and instead just charged straight for the general. And on the first thrust, the enemy general fell to Zhao Yun, and it turns out this general's name is Xiahou En and is a distant relative to Cao Cao. So Cao Cao entrusted him with the honorary role of sword bearer. Cao Cao had two legendary swords in his possession, one called Yi Tian and one called Qinggang. Cao Cao personally carries Yi Tian, while Qinggang is carried by Xiahou En in a largely ceremonial role. Now, Xiahou En is not a capable fighter or a renowned general. He simply left camp in the early hours with a few riders to see if he can loot the battlefield, as it was clear that their side has crushed Liu Bei's force the night before and the battle was won. But unfortunately for him, he ran into Zhao Yun. After killing Xiahou En, Zhao Yun took an interest in the sword on his back because the sheath was gilded with gold. Taking a closer look, Zhao Yun could make out the word Qinggang on the sheath. So right there, Zhao Yun knew it must be a famous blade to be given a name. So from that point on, Zhao Yun not only carried his spear in hand, but also wielded the Qinggang sword. So he continued his search for Lady Mi and the young lord. Zhao Yun was forced to fight many scattered groups of enemy along the way until all his riders had fallen. Alone but not discouraged, Zhao Yun asked every group of refugee he encounters if they had seen Lady Mi, until finally a group told him that they had seen a nicely dressed lady with a leg wound holding a baby a while back. Delighted to finally hear some news, Zhao Yun rode forth toward the spot, and sure enough, Lady Mi was resting on the ground next to a dried up well, nursing a rather badly wounded leg, with A Dou in her arms. Seeing Zhao Yun, Lady Mi cried out and told Zhao Yun to quickly take A Dou and go, but Zhao Yun insists on offering his horse to Lady Mi and defend the mother and child on foot. Lady Mi shakes her head and says, "Without a horse, there will be no hope for any of them to make it out alive. Please, take the child and go." As the two bickered with enemies closing in, Lady Mi shoves A Dou into Zhao Yun's arms and dives into the dried well behind them, plunging to her death. Seeing that Lady Mi has sacrificed herself, Zhao Yun pushes in the well to give her somewhat of a proper burial and to prevent the enemy to retrieve her body. Then he unties his chest plate and secures A Dou in its place, leaps onto the horse, and charges back out into the swarm of enemies. As he tried to make his way back toward Zhang Fei and Liu Bei, Zhao Yun was first stopped by a general named Yan Ming, who was a subordinate of Cao Hong. As Yan Ming charged at Zhao Yun with his trident, Zhao Yun answered with his spear. Within 3 rounds, Yan Ming lay lifeless on the ground, and his infantry soon scattered as Zhao Yun continued his charge. But he was soon stopped by Zhang He. Now, Zhang He is a famed general that used to work for Yuan Shao. After 10 exchanges with him, Zhao Yun quickly realized that Zhang He is not a pushover, and he can't take him lightly. So fearing that he would be soon swarmed by enemy foot soldiers, Zhao Yun whips his horse as hard as he can as he tries to escape from the duel. But Zhao Yun's horse, already exhausted from almost half a day of fighting, took a stumble into a small pit along the road. Just as Zhang He rode up from behind and was about to thrust his spear into the pit at Zhao Yun, legend has it that a ray of red light beamed out from the pit as Zhao Yun's horse leaped out. That sight shook Zhang He's horse as he was forced to give up his chase. Now remember, our lore is from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which was a heavily fictional work based on folklores and works of opera, so please forgive the fantasy element here. Anyways, as Zhao Yun continues on, he was soon flanked on 2 sides by 4 generals. From the front are generals Jiao Chu and Zhang Nan, and from the rear are generals Ma Ting and Zhang Yi. Like Zhang He, all 4 of these generals are surrender generals that used to work for Yuan Shao, but unlike Zhang He, they were no match for Zhao Yun, even when combined. As their 4 weapons swung at Zhao Yun unleashed the Qinggang sword, which cuts through metal like butter. As Zhao Yun beat back the 4 generals, he found himself surrounded by enemy infantry, so he tried his best to utilize the sword to cut a clean path for himself. Far away, on the high ground, Cao Cao is monitoring the entire battlefield along with many of his top generals, and the sight of so many of his men circling around this one rider covered in blood who is cutting his way through thousands of infantry sparked Cao Cao's interest. Cao Cao sends out Cao Hong to write down and get the name of this enemy officer. So Cao Hong rides up only close enough to be within earshot of Zhao Yun and yells out to him, asking his name. Zhao Yun yells back his name, and Cao Hong reports back to Cao Cao. And if we learn anything about Cao Cao so far in any of our lore series, we should know that Cao Cao thirsts for talent. So Cao Cao orders his army to try to capture Zhao Yun alive and forbids anyone from shooting arrows at him. With this order, Zhao Yun and the young lord tied to his chest lucked out that day, as Zhao Yun continued to fight his way towards Changban Bridge with no one able to stop him. By the time he got close enough to see the bridge, only 2 generals stood in his way. These 2 generals are the Zhong brothers, who served under Xiahou Dun. The older brother, Zhong Jin, uses a giant axe, and the younger one, Zhong Shen, uses a ji. They rode out together to fight Zhao Yun, and within the first 3 rounds, Zhao Yun manages to kill Zhong Jin as his axe was too clumsy to deflect thrusts from Zhao Yun's spear, but an enraged Zhong Shen continued to fight to revenge his older brother, and eventually manages to pin Zhao Yun's spear with his ji. Unfortunately for him, As their two weapons tangled together, Zhao Yun let go of his own spear and grabbed onto Zhongshen's weapon with his left hand and drew the Qinggang sword with his right, and with one quick swipe, Zhongshen's head and helmet detached from his neck. With the path to the bridge finally clear, Zhao Yun quickly rode towards Zhang Fei. Now, by this time, Zhao Yun had been fighting non-stop for almost 12 hours, and his total kill count of just named generals from Cao Cao's side amounted to over 50. But behind him, as Cao Ren, Li Dian, Xiahou Dun, Xiahou Yuan, Yue Jin, Zhang Liao, Zhang He, Xu Chu, and many more generals rode behind him, Zhao Yun was no longer in any shape to take on all these heavyweights. So Zhao Yun yells out to Zhang Fei for help, and Zhang Fei rode forth and told Zhao Yun to cross the bridge as he stared down at Cao Cao's army alone in front of the bridge. As many of the generals here had already been burned before, both figuratively and literally, by Zhuge Liang's ambushes, no one wanted to advance towards the bridge, as the dust behind the bridge was a clear sign of ambush. So Cao Ren sends a messenger back to Cao Cao asking for what their next step should be. Soon, Cao Cao personally arrives on the scene and takes one look at Zhang Fei. Seeing that Cao Cao has arrived, Zhang Fei lets out a roar as he yells, "I am Zhang Fei from Yan. Who dares to come forth for a duel to the death?" As this roar echoes throughout Cao Cao's army like a roaring thunder, Cao Cao looks to those around him and says, "This must be Zhang Fei, Guan Yu's brother. Remember when Guan Yu told us that Zhang Fei could ride into an army of millions and take any head he pleased? We must be careful here." But before Cao Cao could even finish this sentence, Zhang Fei lets out another roar and repeats his statement even louder. Now, this roar was so loud that some of the units in the front took a step back involuntarily, and many of the horses turned their head out of fear. Sensing that the enemy is wavering, Zhang Fei lets out a third and final roar that was even louder than the two previous ones, and yells out, "If you want to fight, then fight. If you want to run, then run. Don't just stand here." And before Zhang Fei's roar finished echoing among Cao Cao's men, Cao Cao hears a loud thud right next to him. To find out the cause of the sudden loud thud around Cao Cao, and if Zhang Fei can hold back all of Cao Cao's men alone, come back tomorrow as we conclude part 1 of our ChiBi lore trilogy.